After the Soviet Union's collapse, Western leaders believed that diplomatic engagement and economic ties would gradually liberalize Russia. Instead, of course, the opposite has happened. Under President Vladimir Putin, Russia's brand of modern authoritarianism hasn't just survived, it's become a model for strongmen around the world. Today, hundreds of thousands of Russians are living in exile, many of whom fled political persecution or mobilization. Inside the country, nearly all independent media have been banned, while pro government and pro war propaganda are totally ubiquitous. The vast majority of opposition politicians are either in exile, in prison, or dead. And at 72 years old, Putin looks as likely as ever to remain in power for years to come. In the mid 20th century, the situation in the Soviet Union looked similarly hopeless. For most citizens and foreign observers alike, the USSR seemed eternal, and while it was far less common for the Kremlin to kill dissidents outright in the post Stalin period than it is today, that era's political reality brought its own challenges. With little tradition of resistance to totalitarianism to draw from, citizens who came up against the arbitrary nature of the Soviet justice system had to create their own strategies for resisting and effecting change. Some of these people, like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, became household names, but the focus on their individual stories, which is in part a consequence of the biases of Western journalists of the time, can obscure the fuller picture of how the Soviet dissident movement coalesced. That story is the subject of Benjamin Nathans' new book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. And it's the focus of today's episode. Welcome to The Naked Pravda. Hi, I'm Sam Brazil, Senior News Editor at Medusa in English, and you're listening to The Naked Pravda. This week I spoke with Benjamin Nathans, author of To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, which won a Pulitzer Prize last month. We talked about the unlikely figures who shaped the Soviet dissident movement, how their goals and the values they appealed to changed over time, and what their experience can offer people resisting authoritarianism today. So without further ado, here's our conversation. Welcome, Dr. Benjamin Nathans. You are the Alan Charles Coors Endowed Term Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And you're the author of the new book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. And it's a pleasure to have you here on The Naked Pravda.
Thank you.
So yeah, it occurred to me while we were solving our technical difficulties that I'm wondering, while you just went on this European book tour, is that right?
Right.
Did you have any conversations with exiled Russians or other former Soviet countries about parallels between the period that you wrote about and the current day, where there's at least sort of a need for a dissident movement again? Did anything like this come up? Did you have any interesting conversations?
At every single talk or roundtable, what you describe happened.
Okay.
Immigrants from the Russian Federation, from Ukraine, from other former Soviet republics. And perhaps not surprisingly, at most of the talks and roundtables, the question also came up about dissent in the United States and the sort of unforeseen resonance of the book's message in the America of Donald Trump.
Sure, I didn't even think to ask about that, but you must have had an American book tour in the last 6 months, yes, or not yet?
It wasn't really a tour, but I've been doing a bunch of talks, here and there, and continue to do them. And yes, that issue, I mean, obviously it came up much more after the election, not so much at the earliest conversations I had, but it's almost inescapable now, I would say, based on my experience anyway.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into, I don't want to get too into the weeds of the book, but the concepts of the book, because I have some questions about how relevant the approaches that people you write about in your book could be today, almost in any country, because the world is so different despite the parallels. So on that note, I was struck early on in reading this book by how many assumptions are buried behind terms like rights and justice and citizen in the Soviet context versus the Western context. A lot of these words mean things that are completely different to, what I know them to mean in my country. rights in the United States are so associated with negative rights, the rights that the state shouldn't interfere with, which is totally different from the conception of rights under Soviet constitutions. So could you
Mhm.
describe a little bit the nature of the Soviet justice system going into the 60s and 70s, and the dissidents that you write about?
Sure. Um, so the Soviet justice system and the legal system more generally was still very much a work in progress in the 1960s. And one of the most interesting things that I found about it when I was doing my research was that some of the most fundamental principles of any legal system, like um, the status of a confession. When a criminal confesses, does that end the case and establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? Or are there reasons to be concerned about confessions not containing the whole truth, or perhaps not containing any truth at all? The question of the presumption of innocence. Is the assumption going into a trial that the defendant is innocent until proven guilty, or guilty until proven innocent? That principle had not been settled when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the debates about it are incredibly interesting, both by professional jurists, but also by other interested parties. So there's a sense in which everything is still up for grabs. And I would say generally for the period that the book deals with, the post-Stalin era, the sort of second act of Soviet history, what you find is a system that's trying to professionalize itself to become a system that really is based on the rule of law, but is still struggling with the legacy of the Stalin era, when law was almost entirely subordinated to politics and to ideology. So the watchword of the period was socialist legality, which is a phrase that needs to be understood as a contrast to two things. Um, the most obvious contrast is to what the Bolsheviks used to call bourgeois legality, the forms of legal reasoning and legal practice in Western countries. But the other sort of opposite against which socialist legality is trying to define itself is revolutionary legality, which was the approach taken in the early years of the Bolshevik regime in the 1920s, when the idea was you didn't need a whole scaffolding of lawyers and professional judges and elaborate courtroom procedures and appeals processes. What you really needed was for the people judging guilt, innocence in any given case to have the right instincts. And if they were workers and they were part of the politically conscious proletariat, then they would render what was called revolutionary justice, justice based on the moral intuition of the working class. And that was sort of the reigning principle for about a decade, until the Bolshevik leadership realized that that could lead to very unpredictable consequences, and they started to commit themselves to a professional bar association, lawyers and judges and evidence and the whole apparatus. But it really took a long time for that to work itself out, and that process continues into the 1960s and 70s and beyond.
Mm. So your book doesn't have a main character really, and you take care not to name anyone as the leader of the dissident movement or anything. But Alexander Volpin's ideas and his civic appeal and his glasnost meeting kind of set in motion a lot of the work and the demonstrations that you write about. Could you explain his background a little bit, especially as a mathematician, and how it led him to his main insight about how to affect change, which it's a really unlikely story when you read it from outside of that
Yes.
context.
Yeah. I like to think of Alexander Volpin, who I had the great pleasure of meeting and interviewing several times. I like to think of him as the intellectual godfather of the dissident movement. Most definitely not the leader. He was not a leader type. But more importantly, most of the movement resisted having any leaders. And it was really the KGB and the Western press that was constantly looking for leaders, especially male leaders, even though the movement itself was kind of allergic to that structure. So Volpin is an absolutely fascinating character. He's the extramarital son of one of the most famous Russian poets of the 20th century, Sergei Yesenin, who was a household name in the Soviet Union for virtually its entire existence, but is far less well known in the West. Um, and So Volpin was born as a result of an affair between Sergei Yesenin and a translator, a Russian Jewish translator named Nadezhda Volpina, um, in Moscow. And he grew up in an intelligentsia family. His father committed suicide when Alexander was just 1 year old, so he really didn't know his father at all, except through his poetry. And Alexander Volpin went on to study mathematics at Moscow State University. I think it's fair to say that he was a math prodigy, and he was especially interested in the nature of truth statements in mathematics. How do you know that a given statement is true or false? What's the nature of proving something? So you could call him a mathematical logician, um, or a meta mathematician, someone who is interested in the nature of mathematical statements themselves beyond any specific domain like, algebra or matrix theory or calculus or whatever. I should say right up front, Volpin's mathematics is so difficult and complicated that I gave up hope fairly early on in understanding his mathematical research. And I actually showed some of his mathematical work to colleagues of mine here at Penn in the math department, and they really couldn't make a lot of sense of it either. So it's extremely abstruse and abstract. I was interested in trying to tease out the connections between his mathematical interests and his activism in the rights cause. And that's where the story got really interesting, because Volpin really sort of came of age intellectually in the 1950s in a period where this movement known as cybernetics was sweeping the world, or at least the Western world. And cybernetics begins basically with an MIT professor named Norbert Wiener, who was interested in developing a technique for translating all kinds of phenomena into the quantifiable language of algorithms. So he, you could say, was an early thinker in what we now call computer science. And Volpin was very much influenced by the cybernetics movement. He was also influenced by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, and in particular by Wittgenstein's interest in creating or discovering an ideal language. And this is the movement known as ideal language philosophy. I'm going to be very brief here because I spent a whole chapter on this in the book, but the essence of it is that Wittgenstein thought that most of the classic philosophical problems were really just artifacts of the ambiguity of our language, of the way any given word can mean more than one thing at the same time. So, take the word patient. As a noun, it means someone who's going to be seen by a doctor or is being treated by a doctor. As an adjective, it means someone who has the capacity to wait. I don't think there's any connection between those two meanings. And there are thousands of words that have multiple meanings that are seemingly unrelated to each other. And following Wittgenstein, Volpin became convinced that our real problems as thinkers is that we're using an operating system, whether it's Russian or English or any other human language, that is just full of confusion and ambiguity, and that we'll only really be able to think in a rigorous scientific way if we switch to a language that is absolutely free of ambiguities. And for him, that was mathematics. The holy grail was to be able to translate human puzzles and challenges into the language of mathematics. And he worked at this for many years, and he never succeeded in creating a perfect language free of ambiguity. But because he bumped into, to put it mildly, the Soviet punitive system under Stalin in the late 1940s and early 50s, which resulted in him being arrested and sent into exile and being confined to a psychiatric hospital against his will. He found himself with a lot of time on his hands and became interested in Soviet law, this apparatus through which he had sort of passed into these various punitive institutions. So he started reading the Soviet Constitution, the one that was ratified in 1936 and was known as the Stalin Constitution. And he started reading the Soviet Code of Criminal Procedure. And he had this kind of eureka moment where he realized that while he had failed so far to produce a perfect language free of ambiguity, Soviet law, in a way, was trying to do the same thing. It was trying to describe what citizens are allowed to do, what citizens are required to do, and what citizens are forbidden from doing. These are the three fundamental moral categories in the law: permissions, um, uh, injunctions, and uh, being forbidden to do things. And so he sort of started to look at Soviet law as his plan B, the next best thing to an ideal language. And he was just sort of waiting for an opportunity to use Soviet law to express this idea that if the government would just live up to its own laws, the Soviet system would be much safer, much more predictable, much less lethal in its interactions with its own citizens. And that became the grand strategy of the dissident movement, trying to get the Soviet government to observe its own laws, not to topple the Soviet government, not to take over power themselves, not to change the Soviet system, but a very kind of minimalist platform of just making the government obey its own laws.
Hmm. But when you draw the line from that idea and the background, which sounds so esoteric and abstruse, as you said, to like the establishment of the Moscow Helsinki group, like, and all the things that happened in between, and Red Square demonstration after the Prague Spring, it's kind of unbelievable that an idea that just took you that long to explain briefly, has real world consequences. So maybe I'm getting ahead, but I wonder what you think if there are takeaways for, people today dealing with authoritarian tactics or authoritarian regimes. It seems
Sure.
like it's impossible that anybody could take a lot. Like, I mean, it seems like this wouldn't work in Russia today, in Putin's Russia. No part of it. What do you think?
Well, first, let me just back up to the beginning of your question. It is an amazing story of how you get from this very esoteric idea to a set of practices that ended up bending the arc of the Cold War, of the history of the Soviet Union, and of the second half of the 20th century. It was not a straight line by any means. I mean, the subtitle of my book is The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement.
Right.
One meaning of the subtitle is that I want to pay attention to all the people whose names have been forgotten, not the super famous ones like Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, but the people who actually built the movement and who propelled it. But the second meaning of the subtitle is The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, is that the dissident movement had several near-death experiences and had to reinvent itself several times. And that's what I mean by it not being a straight line. This is a very complicated and zigzag pattern of development. There's no sort of internal logic that unfolds seamlessly. And yeah, you're right to ask about what, if anything, from this story might be relevant in today's Russia. So I try to do justice to the dissidents in this book, and I try to excavate and recover their worldviews and their ways of being in the world, not just what they thought, but what they did. That's really what distinguished them, is their activism in the defense of rights. But I don't always take their point of view, and I have a number of critical things to say about the movement. And one of the big takeaways of the book is that while the rule of law, I think, is an absolutely indispensable part of running any modern society in a way that's not only efficient, but also just, it's not sufficient. The rule of law as a platform is not sufficient by itself to launch, let alone successfully run an opposition movement. There has to be a political agenda and political ideas beyond just lawfulness. And one of the really peculiar things about the Soviet dissidents, these people who became famous all over the world for being so brave politically and being politically active in the public life of their country, is that they maintained from start to finish that they were not political actors, that their movement was not political, that it was outside or above the realm of politics. Just like for many, many years, the field of human rights was understood as something that was outside or above politics. I think that's a strategic mistake to position things that way. I think law and rights, civil rights, human rights they do participate in the arena of politics. It's not that they're nothing but politics. They also have a moral dimension, but to try to disentangle them from everything political, I think, is a mistake. So the dissidents were extremely brave and extraordinarily clever in using the platform of the rule of law. But in the end, that platform alone did not succeed. And I don't think it would succeed by itself today. For one thing, authoritarian governments are now much more sophisticated than Brezhnev and the Soviet Politburo was about manipulating the legal system itself, manipulating constitutions, legal codes, not to mention courts and judges. And today's Russian government is a much more sophisticated manipulator of its own legal system than the Soviet regime ever was.
Mm. You note that in the years before any kind of recognizable dissident movement or momentum came together, one of the things preventing a large social movement from forming was not total atomization like we think of in totalitarian societies, but actually like the tendency for members of the intelligentsia to be strongly connected to small social circles. And this seems a little counterintuitive that this would prevent momentum from gathering. Could you draw out a bit like why this was the case, and then how Volkin's civic appeal and Glasnost meeting kind of made the chain reaction possible or started this process, the chain reaction that you describe? I don't know if that's your term.
It's not my term. That's borrowed from a contemporary account that described the process using the chain reaction analogy.
That's right.
Yeah. So the cliche about totalitarian societies is that they atomize their populations and they prevent people from forming horizontal bonds among themselves so that they are maximally weakened with respect to this overbearing state, the highly ambitious totalitarian state. And I mean, observers of the Soviet Union already started saying in the 1970s that that's not an accurate description of the Soviet Union. Certainly not of the Soviet Union after Stalin died. And I really emphasize in the book how different the second act of Soviet history, the post-1953 period, is from the first act. The first act is the bloodiest, most dramatic few decades of human history you can imagine. World War, revolution, civil war, collectivization, breakneck industrialization, terror, purges, another world war. I mean, history doesn't get any more dramatic than that. And the second act doesn't have that kind of mass violence, but it's got a lot of other things going on that I think are no less interesting and no less consequential. So, excuse me, your question is about sort of what social relations are like under this regime. And in the second half of Soviet history, what many people have found, including people who observed it firsthand, is that the human friendships that were formed, adult friendships, were really quite powerful, enduring, and they really go very much against the stereotype of totalitarian regimes, which is one reason why I think the totalitarian label becomes less and less useful analytically for describing the Soviet Union under Khrushchev or under Brezhnev. What I found in my research, and this was based on a lot of different kinds of sources, memoirs, interrogation transcripts, personal letters, interviews, lots and lots of different kinds of source materials. What I found was that within the dissident setting, the level of intimacy and trust among the participants, men and women, most of them in their late 20s or 30s or 40s, some older, the level of trust and loyalty was extraordinarily high. I mean, these are people who were ready to risk their futures, their careers, their lives to defend their friends in the movement. But the counterpart of that very high level of trust within these small sort of face-to-face communities was a very low, I would say almost catastrophically low level of social trust in Soviet society generally. And this was a direct legacy of the Stalin era, when social trust, people's attitude towards strangers, was just as mistrustful as you can imagine because of the fear of being denounced or informed upon. And the sociologists who study social movements comparatively across time and across different countries and societies, they all note that to move from a small group of like-minded friends to a real broad social movement involving people who don't know each other personally requires the use of what they call weak ties. So strong ties are ties based on personal friendship, knowledge. Often there are kinship ties embedded in these strong tie networks, and we see that in a dissident movement where there are lots of people who are married to each other or who are related to each other by family ties of one kind or another. To build a social movement, you need to move beyond those strong ties and start bringing people in and bonding them to the movement through weaker, more instrumental or functional ties. And this is the challenge that Alexander Volpin, really tried to conquer. That is, when he organized the first Glasnost meeting, he really wanted there to be people there that he had never seen before. He wanted to see unfamiliar faces, which was totally counterintuitive because most people, well, first of all, most people would never be caught dead going to a demonstration like that because it was so risky. But among those who could be persuaded to take part, they didn't want to see strangers because they didn't trust strangers. And they could never be sure that those strangers weren't undercover KGB agents or people working for other branches of the Soviet intelligence services. But Volpin insisted that a demonstration can only be described as successful if you see people there that you've never seen before. And that remained a challenge from start to finish. And essentially the movement never really, its maximum success was in the year 1968, about 3 years into this chain reaction. I mean, you asked what the chain reaction was. The chain reaction refers to a genuinely spontaneous growing of the movement, expansion of the movement, whereby, people get arrested at a protest. The people who are arrested get put on trial. Secret transcripts get made of that trial, what was said by the defendants and the prosecutor and the judge. Those transcripts circulate by samizdat. The government, the KGB, goes after the creators of the transcript or the people who are circulating it, and they arrest them, and there are new protests, and it's just like it's like an avalanche. And that the chain reaction unfolded between 1965 and 1968 to the point where by the spring of 1968, almost 1,000 people had signed one or another petition or letter defending those who had been arrested and insisting that their trials be open to scrutiny by the public. But 1,000 really core committed activists is about the largest the movement ever got. It had many, many more people who read samizdat and who were plugged into samizdat networks. And I think millions of people were listening to the shortwave radio stations, the Voice of America, the BBC, the Deutsche Welle, and others, and hearing dissident texts read over the airwaves. We now would call this an audio book. We didn't have that term in the 1960s, but that's in fact what it was. Millions of people listening, but in terms of the core activists, probably not more than about 1,000 in various cities, Moscow, Kyiv, Leningrad, and others. So that remained a constant challenge of how big can the movement become and how trusting can its members be? And in the end, they preferred to remain a small elite of activists, wary of building bridges to other segments of Soviet society. And that was something that limited the movement's impact inside the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. This question just occurs to me now, but attentive students of history will notice that the Soviet Union continued after 1968, which you said was like the peak of this movement's volume. So I wonder why you decided, did you just decide to write about these people out of personal admiration and interest? Because they didn't cause the collapse of the Soviet Union and that wasn't their goal. What do you feel that they achieved, I guess?
Well, about my motives, I came to this project with sort of a fundamental question in my mind, and that was, how do people who live in authoritarian societies construe their political options? How do they think about what it means to be politically engaged in public? And then how, who among that group decides to act on those ideas of public political engagement, and how do they act on their own ideas? And, because of my training, I wanted to pursue that question in the setting of the Soviet Union, but I recognized at the time that it was relevant to all kinds of different countries. I mean, to China, to Iran, to North Korea. At the time, I started working on this quite a few years ago, and at the time, I didn't think this was a question that I needed to pose to my own country, to the United States. But soon after the book came out, a lot of people were saying, yeah, we're wondering that too. Like, what does it mean to be a dissident in the United States in the Trump era? And what are really our political options? What kinds of meaningful political activism can people engage in this country, and at what cost? So that was sort of what got me into it. So as I started exploring the dissidents, they are almost by definition unusual people. I mean, to have taken the risk of engaging in that kind of behavior required you to be, in some ways, not a typical human being. Someone who had very strong beliefs, very high-minded, very idealistic, in a setting that was just saturated with cynicism. I do think the dissidents were profoundly Soviet. I mean, they were really Soviet people. They were not like little Western liberals who just happened to be born on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. And I try to show the ways in which that movement emerged from Soviet society itself. But they are fascinating. They are, I mean, many of them in person were both exhilarating and frustrating to talk to, as strong-minded people often are. I didn't want to portray them as saints or heroes. That's been done already. I wasn't interested in doing that yet again. I wanted to see them in the fullness of their humanity and in the context in which they lived and worked. Their own goals, as you said, were not to topple the Soviet regime. Their goal was to make the Soviet government more law-abiding, to make it more predictable. And they wanted to do that by spreading legal consciousness among Soviet citizens and by modeling what it meant to behave in a fully lawful, transparent manner. That didn't work. Didn't work at all. The Soviet Union did not become a more law-abiding state in the 1970s and 80s. If anything, it became less law-abiding, for reasons I can go into later if you're interested. But as so often happens in history, there were unintended consequences of this movement. And one of them was to expose the lawlessness of the Soviet government over and over and over again. And it's very hard, if you're a Soviet official or leader, to make a credible case that you are the vanguard of history, that you represent the cutting edge of human evolution, the motion through socialism to the communist future. Very hard to make that case in a credible way if someone is showing over and over again that you can't even obey your own laws. So unintentionally, the dissidents contributed to the delegitimizing of the Soviet state. They kind of hollowed out. Obviously, they weren't the only ones that were producing that effect, but they contributed to the hollowing out of the legitimacy of the Soviet government. And that, I think, is a crucial factor if you want to understand why that government collapsed so suddenly when it did in 1991. I mean, the Soviet collapse was just the weirdest thing ever. You know, this superpower that wasn't under attack by another country. Its economy wasn't doing great, but it wasn't as bad as the Great Depression in the West in the 1930s. Things were not desperate. There was no life-threatening crisis. There was just a gradual decline in performance. And for a superpower like that to collapse like a house of cards, let's just say that's not something that happens every day or every month, every century. And the speed of the collapse, I think, can only be understood if you understand that the system was already very brittle, very hollowed out. And part of that hollowing out, I think, was because of what the dissidents were able to show.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That's a surprise. I mean, I don't remember the collapse of the Soviet Union. I wasn't alive yet, but it's very weird when you read about it, but it's not people don't always attribute it at all to the actions of dissidents. It's kind of part of the story, but it's interesting to hear you say. Um, in terms of exposing contradictions, this book is full of moments where individuals that you write about, like fully dedicated, true believers in the Soviet system, kind of earlier in their story, encounter some personal moral dilemma or are faced with a contradiction in Soviet ideology that disillusions them and leads to some kind of personal political transformation. And I wanted to ask if you have like a favorite of these moments, but I mean, my favorite that I would love to get you to kind of recount because it's kind of riveting to read is Andrei Sinyavsky's relationship with Helene Peltier, and how that influences both of them and how it ends, kind of abruptly.
Yeah. So you're referencing one of the great writers of the Soviet era, the second half of the Soviet era, Andrei Sinyavsky, who before he became known as under his pseudonym Abram Terz, was I would say, moderately well-known literary critic in Moscow. But more importantly, he had met this foreign French graduate student, Helene Peltier, who happened to be the daughter of the French naval attaché in the French embassy in Moscow in the late 40s and early 1950s. And the moral crisis for Sinyavsky came when the KGB tried to recruit him, and did in fact recruit him, to inform on Peltier as a way of getting to her father. Her father, being a member of the French military, meant that he was a target of interest for the KGB, not surprisingly. And in the book, I describe Sinyavsky's relationship with Peltier, which was of great interest in its own right, because this was a cultural encounter of the highest order. This budding literary critic and this young French woman who was very interested in Russian and East European literature and culture, very cultivated herself, interested in getting to know her fellow students. And she was a rare bird in those days. There were very few foreigners in Moscow or anywhere in the Soviet Union in the late Stalin era. And she obviously had special arrangements owing to her father's status at the French embassy. And initially, Sinyavsky, who was a loyal communist and a believer in the party, was willing to go along with the KGB's request that he act as an informer. But he was so attached to Peltier and so engaged with her intellectually, I think platonically is about as far as things got, that he had a moral breakdown, essentially. And he decided at some point, when the KGB asked him to become sexually involved with Peltier and sort of entangle her in a sexual relationship that could then be used to compromise her and her father, Sinyavsky decided that he couldn't go along. And this was, as he put it, his stumbling block. It was not a crisis about his belief in communism. It was something deeply personal, involving another particular unique human being who he just felt he could not betray. What I found is that model of a very personal moral stumbling block was really something that a lot of dissidents had in common. And it became, for me, the leading source of explaining why some people became dissidents. Lots and lots of people, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, were approached by the KGB to become informants. And many of them cooperated to one degree or another. But some of them, either before agreeing to cooperate or after they started acting as informers, just had a crisis of conscience. They tended to be very high-minded people who were brought up on Soviet moral ideals, including ideals of friendship and loyalty to one's friends. And Sinyavsky's stumbling block became a kind of model for me of how to explain the different personal trajectories that brought individuals to the movement. So it was a very powerful story for me.
And did you read her memoirs? It sounded like part of the story was not widely known before, because in the KGB transcripts and notes, they kind of downplayed her personality and her story. Is that right?
Yeah. In most of the literature about this period, she figures, Helene Pelletier figures as the person who helped smuggle Sinyavsky's stories out to the West and get them published. So she's kind of a vehicle. And she also smuggled the stories of Yuli Daniel, the other writer who published abroad under a pseudonym and who was put on trial together with Sinyavsky. What hadn't been treated in much depth was all the other things that Helen Pelletier did and represented for Sinyavsky and his friends. She hasn't written a book-length memoir, to the best of my knowledge, but she did write several very eloquent essays after she returned to France when this whole episode was over. And those essays were extremely useful in getting her perspective on the relationship with Sinyavsky and what happened between them and around them. As a historian, I love having multiple perspectives on the same exact events because, as you probably know, it's not only that two people don't tell the story the same way, they see the story in some fundamentally different ways. I mean, this is just the nature of perception and memory. And so having multiple renditions of the same events, the same relationships is extremely valuable for anyone who's writing history. And I really love working with sources like that.
Mm. One of the major threads or maybe turning points in your book is the transition from revolutionary Leninism being like the dominant idiom, or you call it the lingua franca of the dissidents, to legalism and maybe ultimately like human rights discourse.
Yeah.
What precipitates that? How does that happen? That change?
Yeah. So as paradoxical as it may sound, the main intellectual driver of resistance in the Soviet Union up until the late 1950s was Leninism, Marxism-Leninism. And by main driver, I mean both the source of ideas for opposition movements, but also the source of ideas about how to organize an opposition. So Marxism-Leninism was, the cornerstone of the curriculum, the official curriculum in Soviet schools, elementary, middle, high school, college, across the entire Soviet Union. So anybody who attended a Soviet school, and it was mandatory, of course, was exposed to Marxism-Leninism, some version or some fraction of that way of thinking, and was exposed to the party's version of its own history, the glorious history of the Bolshevik Party, starting as an underground revolutionary movement under Lenin's leadership and inspiration, and up through and past the seizure of power in October 1917. So that language, that rhetoric, those ideas, that model, these were all in people's heads. And if you look at the history of the underground in the Soviet Union in the 30s and 40s and 50s, it consists of people whose main idea is something went really badly wrong with the Soviet government under Stalin. It lost its way. It diverged from the path of true Marxism-Leninism. And our job is to get the ship of state back on that track. That's a mixed metaphor, but to get the train back on the track where it was supposed to be going. And they reproduced the conspiratorial language and methods of the Bolshevik Party. And all of that really was the dominant idiom of resistance in the Soviet Union. That changes in the early 1960s. And I don't have an explanation for that in the book. Somebody else needs to, I think, work on that. It's not that Marxism-Leninism disappears as a language of dissent, but it is eclipsed, I would say, by this new approach that Volpin is offering based on a very literal-minded reading of Soviet law, of the Soviet Constitution and the Criminal Code, and on the strategy of defending rights. And that's why these people really preferred to be called pravozащитники, or rights defenders, not dissidents. None of them really liked that term, although it was kind of inescapable because the Western journalists who covered the movement started using it, and then everybody else got on the bandwagon. But that displacement of Marxism-Leninism by legalism has enormous consequences, and it's really a powerful shift at the time, even though it wasn't really registered, or I only sort of came upon it in retrospect when I realized that this shift had taken place and had made the dissident movement that I studied possible.
Hmm. You mentioned Western journalists imposing the term dissidents, and Western journalism and media coverage and radio is a big driver of a lot of the change that happens in your book. It has consequences, how quickly something appears
Yeah.
on voices on the radio, and then millions of people hear it. I wonder if you could comment on, the Western portrayal of this dissident movements, as a whole. How did they characterize it, and what did they get wrong when you dive into the details of these people's stories? Who did they leave out? And then I'll ask a follow-up question actually after you address that.
Yeah, Western journalists posted in Moscow were really critical to the movement's history because they were the mechanism by which news about dissent in the Soviet Union reached a Western audience, and then, as you said, through the voices, through these shortwave radio programs, was boomeranged back to the Soviet Union. I mean, it's an amazing communication network that the dissidents could reach people sometimes literally down the street through this shortwave satellite radio system. You couldn't think up a more dramatic way to transmit ideas and information from Soviet citizens to Soviet citizens. So the Western journalists were, on the whole, a very talented bunch. They were all men, and I'll come back to that in a minute. In the decades of the Cold War, to be posted to Moscow was a very prestigious position, whether you were working for, the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Le Monde or the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or any of the Western newspapers. That was a plum position. So these were very talented and ambitious people. They had a very frustrating time at work because so much of Soviet society was off limits to them. And the Soviet government made life difficult for most Western journalists by severely limiting their access to Soviet institutions and Soviet people. But one of the subsets of Soviet society that was delighted to interact with Western journalists were dissidents. Not at first. They shared the fear of being seen having contacts with foreigners, but they got over that fear pretty quickly, and they quickly grasped that the Westerners could be of enormous use to them in getting the word out about what they were up to and their ideas. So I mentioned that the Western journalists were pretty much without exception all men, and that is significant in one very powerful way. The dissident movement was comprised of men and women played a very important role in the creation of some of the most important samizdat journals, in the reproduction of samizdat, in the dissemination of samizdat. They participated in demonstrations. And you mentioned a while back the famous demonstration on Red Square on August 25th, 1968, protesting the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. 4 days earlier, 3 of the 8 protesters there were women. It's not that Western journalists ignored the women, but since journalists were convinced that this movement must have leaders and that the leaders were the ones that they should focus on and interview and make their names known in the West, it's really striking that they only ever assumed that the male participants in this movement could be potential leaders. And that had a distorting effect on the movement's image. And the intensity of the Western media gaze also had a distorting effect within the movement itself, because that media gaze made certain individuals extremely famous, household names all over the world. 2 of them ended up getting the Nobel Prize, Solzhenitsyn in 1970 and Sakharov in 1975. But when you shine a very strong spotlight on people, you see the people who are in the light very well, but everybody who's outside the light is cast in a very dark shadow and becomes almost invisible on the stage. And that's what the Western media gaze did. It created a kind of hierarchy of celebrity within the movement that ended up impacting the movement itself, and in a very personal, but also in a very political way.
I spent a lot of time thinking today about media for Russians inside Russia that's produced outside of Russia, and the distorting effects and the difficulties, and the how in the West people can become household names in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect like the experience of people living in Russian regions, or how famous they are inside Russia. Did you spend any time thinking about this after writing this book, or while talking to people during your book tour, and how difficult it is to reach ordinary Russians today compared to when there were radio programs with a lot of credibility? There's now the, Steve Bannon, like Flood the Zone, I think is really influenced by like Putin approach. Nobody believes anything. Did you have any reflections on this after writing this book? You probably spent a lot of time reading Russian media.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I try to read as much Russian media as possible, including the media that's produced inside the country. Yes, I mean, my first concern was, what am I doing with my own book? Am I giving people a fair shake? And am I partitioning the attention that I give in the book in a way that's defensible, that's justifiable? I mean, I'm really trying to retrieve people, not just their names, but their thinking and their practices, who have essentially been forgotten or largely lost to the historical record. So I did feel kind of self-conscious about not creating another version of the Western gaze that would someday be found equally tainted or biased. That's the first thing I would say. I am very keen to reach a Russian audience with this book, and I certainly wrote the book with my Russian friends and acquaintances and colleagues in mind. I don't want this to sound like, an American, or God forbid, a Cold War analysis of the phenomenon that itself unfolded during the Cold War. I'm trying to achieve a different analytic standpoint on the topic. In terms of, media today, it's very difficult to cover Russia right now. I mean, it's, Western journalists have had a very challenging time keeping their finger on the pulse, especially inside Russia. And now we have dozens and dozens of some of the most talented journalists from Russia essentially forced to operate from outside the country, which is a huge disadvantage, both in terms of access to sources, but also the capacity to reach readers and viewers in Russia. But the technology is there to at least try to do that. And I think we have to make maximum use of whatever limited access we have to Russians as both sources and readers, and people to be in dialogue with about the questions of the day.